Up next, an explosion rips through an Illinois church.
The town was terrified.
Evidence was everywhere.
We found evidence on top of buildings. The debris field was huge.
Two teenagers implicate one another. Dungeons and Dragons looks like the cause.
I thought that was an incredibly stupid thing to do.
But a thin blue wire tells a different story. Oakwood, Illinois, is a quiet, small town of less than 1,000 residents and little, if any, violent crime. At the Oakwood Methodist Church, as volunteers prepared for their Christmas celebration, church member Brian Plower walked outside, where something caught his attention.
Some of us thought that maybe a vehicle had driven into the church.
We got there right after the first responders did, and their first reaction was that it was a gas explosion.
46-year-old Brian Plower was killed instantly. He left behind a wife and 3 children.
Very charismatic, gregarious. Brian never met anybody he didn't like.
Bill Adams' daughter walked out just moments before the explosion.
It is by pure chance that it could have been my daughter, you know. I've often thought that Brian took what could have happened to my daughter.
Agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives were called in to investigate.
We found metal fragmentation. We found pieces of pipe nipple. We picked up any pieces of wire. We found batteries. We did find some 9-volt batteries. We picked up everything.
This clearly eliminated a gas line explosion. These were the ingredients of a pipe bomb, a homemade device in which gunpowder is packed into a steel pipe closed with metal end caps. In this case, fragments of red-painted end caps were found in the rubble, along with 30-gauge blue insulated silver-coated copper wire.
This was not very common wire. It could be a particular signature of the bomber.
A signature is something unusual or unique left by the bomber, often without knowing it.
We actually found a piece of green plastic that had a label on it that said Igloo Legend 12, which is a cooler.
This meant the pipe bomb was inside the cooler, activated with a tripwire. Investigators did not believe that the victim was the intended target.
It was very apparent to us that this was very random. There was nothing in Mr. Plower's background to indicate him being the target of a crime.
After some digging, investigators learned 2 important pieces of information. First, the only store within 25 miles that sold 30-gauge blue insulated silver-coated copper wire was the local Radio Shack electronics store.
Since only one merchandiser sold that wire, if they kept records of their transactions, that could prove helpful in getting a lead.
And there was only one store that sold the Igloo brand Legend 12 cooler.
We found out that that color scheme was only sold at Walmart. So that narrowed our focus then on where that cooler could have been purchased.
Then, investigators got an anonymous tip that 2 students at Oakwood High School might have been involved.
One of them had a past criminal history, with one of the offenses being arson.
One of the subjects had been seen in possession of a notebook that had handwritten on the front of it bomb recipes.
The teenagers, 18-year-old Jimmy Morris and 16-year-old Phil Ryan, had no alibis for the time of the bombing.
At first, they said that they were driving past the scene when the explosion happened. Then they said that they were there within moments and saw Brian Plower in the moments just before the explosion.
From a photo lineup, employees at the local Radio Shack store identified Jimmy Morris as having been in their store, but couldn't recall what he purchased.
Everything that the investigation showed about the teenagers indicated that they could be involved in this.
Investigators also learned that the boys were heavily involved in the game Dungeons and Dragons, a fantasy-oriented game played by more than 20 million people worldwide. It allows participants to assume imaginary, often violent identities.
There had been, across the country, instances where the role-playing within the game of Dungeons and Dragons had turned violent in real life.
Both teenagers denied involvement in the bombing and were given polygraphs.
The polygraph indicated that they were giving some deceptive answers when questioned about bombs and bomb making.
Eventually, they each implicated the other.
Both subjects stated that they saw the other subject in possession of a green cooler.
It looked like investigators had solved the case until there was another bombing just 5 miles away. The First Assembly of God Church in Danville, Illinois, was located 5 miles away from the location of the first bomb.
The blast injured 33 people.
Most of them teenagers.
Youth injured in the church bombing may never recover emotionally.
This second bombing was more powerful than the first.
When we first arrived on the scene, we were in shock. There was a hole in the west wall that was big enough to drive a truck through. It was unbelievable.
The explosion happened next to the pews where a church youth group was sitting. 33 people were injured.
They had shrapnel that had been embedded in their face, some in their ears. This was just an explosion of such a powerful magnitude that debris rained down on them.
Which is something that you don't see every day. It involved 2 churches. You don't see a lot of crime against churches.
The ATF looked everywhere for pieces of the explosive device.
We found evidence on top of buildings, everywhere. There was just, the debris field was huge.
Eventually, ATF investigators found more than 20 different bomb components, which enabled them to build a replica. This one was triggered with a timer and was clearly larger and more powerful than the first.
There were a lot of differences there, which leaves you with 2 alternatives. Either is experimenting, graduating up to bigger and better things. The other alternative is that it was 2 separate people that made these devices.
To find out, forensic examiners looked at the wire from the second bomb site. Was this the same signature wire used in the first bomb?
It was a silver-coated, single-strand copper wire with blue insulation.
It's 30 gauge. It's a very small wire.
But was it the same wire? ATF examiner Greg Cleese examined the extrusion marks made on the plastic insulation as it squeezed through the die during the manufacturing process. This process makes the wire its uniform size.
Those marks will be imparted on that plastic insulation for a number of feet before it changes dramatically.
Lined up on a comparison microscope, there was no doubt. The wire from both bomb sites came from the same source.
In fact, that these were produced on the same forming die at the same plant.
They also discovered both bombs used the same glue and the same cotton string. Since both bombs appeared to be made by the same individual, this eliminated Jimmy Morris and Phil Ryan. They both had solid alibis for the second bombing. But why did these boys implicate themselves in the first place?
They offered an explanation that they were doing this because they were playing this Dungeons and Dragons game.
They really spent a lot of time wasting the time of investigators.
I thought that was an incredibly stupid thing to do.
Then a witness came forward saying she'd seen a white male walking a German Shepherd dog near the church parking lot a few hours before the first bombing. She remembered the dog had a brown leather collar with a brass name tag on it, but she couldn't provide a description of the man. Was this the break investigators needed? After 2 high school students were eliminated as suspects, the ATF continued to search for leads. They suspected that the blue copper wire was purchased at the local Radio Shack store. Unfortunately, most customers who bought this wire paid cash, so this was a dead end. The pipe had been inside a plastic cooler sold only in Walmart stores. Of the hundreds sold, only 3 were purchased with a credit card or check. Those individuals were interviewed and cleared.
It was a dead end. We were unable to associate that cooler with anyone that could be considered a person of interest.
All of the other bomb components were common and could have been purchased anywhere. But investigators needed to find the bomber before he could strike again, since his devices were getting more sophisticated.
We did feel that this was an escalation. It was a bigger device. It happened when more people were present.
Then a tipster came forward, a member of the church where this second bombing took place.
The member of the church come up, said, I don't know if this means much, but there was this gentleman by the name of Mr. White that I know, and that he had actually attended this church approximately 5 to 6 years prior, and had sought actually getting into the church as a member and had been turned down.
40-year-old Richard White lived just 12 miles away from the church with his mother and his teenage daughter.
We also start interviewing everyone that knows Mr. White, friends, family, everyone.
We were told by a lot of the neighbors that Richard Dean White was somebody that you didn't want to mess with.
A background check revealed a troubled past. White was a high school dropout and spent time in the U.S. Army, but was discharged after only 6 weeks. Later, he spent time in 4 different psychiatric hospitals where he was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic.
I believe that he was completely confused. At one time, he felt that there was demons underneath the floor in the bathroom, and he cut the bathroom floor out to get the demons out of there.
Eventually, White got married and landed a job with General Motors. His marriage ended after just 6 months, and he was laid off from his job in 1987.
He had such a hard time becoming involved back in the community. He lost his job. He wasn't able to retain friends or any relationships, and really was forced to move back home with his mother.
White's psychiatric problems may have been the reason why the Danville Church rejected his application for membership.
There has to be an agreement between the board, and because of some of the things that happened that was contributed to him, we didn't think that that would be quite what we wanted at that particular time.
Investigators also learned that Rick's ex-wife was a member of the Oakwood United Methodist Church where the first bombing took place.
I felt like that was what he was trying to strike out against her and get even with her at the time that happened. That was purely speculation on my part. I have no idea.
Then, 4 days after the second church bombing, before investigators could interview Rick White, there was another bombing, this time in a residential neighborhood several miles away.
Bomb number 3. What are we going to do now?
After 2 bombings and 5 months of investigation, the ATF finally had a potential suspect in Rick White. A background check revealed White had a history of psychiatric problems.
I don't know that he had problems making friends. I just don't think Rick wanted friends. His dog was his friend. And so that satisfied Rick.
So investigators decided to pay White a visit.
Tell him I'll be in the garage.
They asked Rick White's mother
Hello.
if they could speak to
Is
him.
Richard home? We need to speak with him.
What's this all about?
We're conducting an investigation.
Investigators found the garage behind the Whites' home in ruins.
I could see steam, smoke. When the explosion went off, it actually pushed the walls out, like I could actually see into the building itself. And there was one victim inside the building, along with a dog, a large dog.
The victim had been decapitated. A driver's license found on the workbench identified him as Richard White.
We did not know if we had a victim or a suspect.
But that question was answered as investigators sifted through the rubble.
There were parts of bombs in there in the process of being made, and tools, wiring, all kinds of things that you could use to make pipe bombs. Circumstantial evidence would indicate that he intended to kill himself to avoid having to talk to the police.
Next to White's body was his German Shepherd dog. It matched the description of the dog given by the witness near the first bomb site.
He was obviously clutching the bomb close to his body, and he had his one friend in the world there with him, his other arm around his dog.
Also in the garage, investigators found blue silver-coated wire, the kind used in the 2 church bombings. They also found a pair of wire cutters. Scientists compared the tool marks from White's wire cutters to the tool marks on the copper wire found at the Danville bomb site.
From that comparison, I was able to conclude that this diagonal cutter that they've recovered in Richard White's garage was, in fact, the diagonal cutter that cut that wire end that was found on the Danville device.
This was forensic proof that White was the bomber.
We found an area of the garage that had red spray paint on it, and contained on that red spray paint were perfectly round circles. The reason that was important was the device that killed Mr. Plower, which was a pipe bomb with end caps on it. Those end caps were painted red with a gold coating.
But questions remained. Why did Rick White target churches? Investigators believe White was angry at the First Assembly of God Church for turning down his membership application. But he couldn't bomb that church, at least not right away. It would have been too obvious. So he chose the Oakwood United Methodist Church as his first target, possibly because his ex-wife was a member.
He was experimenting. He was trying to get different things to work, different initiators for the device, different triggering systems.
The forensic evidence shows that White placed the pipe bomb in a green cooler, not caring who would pick it up. Church member Brian Plower was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. In the First Assembly of God Church bombing, White used a stronger bomb, since this was his primary target. He placed the bomb on top of an outdoor air conditioner. This one had a timer designed to explode during the Sunday service. 33 people were injured.
We were in absolute shock, just like the people in the community, that no one had been killed.
In October of 1998, a grand jury concluded Richard White built both bombs and murdered Brian Plower. The forensic evidence left no doubt.
These investigations did not result in the prosecution. It was closure for the victim's family.
That Richard White did this, we know that he did it. It doesn't really, answer those questions why. It doesn't make the hurt less. There's still pain, there's still, anger, there's still hurt and loss and grief that continues and continues and continues.
With the bombing, the misconception is the blast destroys the evidence. The blast disperses the evidence, where it makes it harder for us to find it, but we'll find it.
Up next, an unexplained death had medical experts baffled.
At the end of the autopsy, I didn't find anything slightly wrong whatsoever.
Each new clue raises more questions.
The trail's getting warmer and warmer.
Until a microscopic clue reveals the ultimate betrayal.
No one would ever expect someone would do this sort of thing to another human being.
Fall means football at the University of Florida. It's also time for thousands of students to get back to their studies. 24-year-old Michelle Herndon was entering her senior year. After graduation, she hoped to do volunteer work.
She wanted to go join the Peace Corps. She had a very long list of dreams and hopes to accomplish.
To pay her way through school, Michelle worked as a personal trainer. Between classes and her job, Michelle kept to a predictable schedule. But one day, shortly before Thanksgiving, she didn't attend any of her classes or show up for work.
This was so unlike her, not to return their calls or not to show up. And I guess their sixth sense was that something is very, very wrong.
Michelle's fiancé, Jason Doyle, immediately drove the 400 miles from his home in Miami to Michelle's home in Gainesville to see what was wrong.
He finds Michelle's house it's locked up. All the doors are locked. All the windows are locked. The outside lights are still on, as they would have been left on from the night before.
Her dog was inside and the TV was on. Through a crack in the blinds, Jason could actually see what later turned out to be Michelle's foot.
When police arrived, they found Michelle's body in her bedroom, face down. It was clear she'd been dead for some time.
She was in a somewhat awkward position with her left arm folded up underneath her body.
At first glance, there was no trauma to the body. No bruises, no wounds, no blood.
We had no indication of what would have caused her death.
The medical examiner thought the position of Michelle's body, face down, was unusual.
If somebody is sick and in the process of dying, most folks tend to end up either on their side or on their back.
There were no foreign fingerprints in the apartment, no signs of forced entry, and no valuables were missing.
Her VCR, her television set, her radio, jewelry, it was all intact.
And there was no indication this was a suicide.
If it's going to be a suicide, there's going to be pill bottles lying around and frequently a note. There was none of that on this case.
There was a half-full bottle of beer next to Michelle's body. Only Michelle's fingerprints were on the bottle.
There was no indication that she had gotten drunk off the one beer that was lying on the bed. There was other beer in the refrigerator. There was just nothing to indicate that she had passed out drunk.
They wanted to see if perhaps something had been inside of the beer bottle, perhaps a foul play, a substance placed in the beer bottle that may have contributed to her death.
but no foreign substances were found inside the bottle.
It was baffling. Wow, how could this healthy 24-year-old young lady have died? And is it even possible that she would have simply died of natural causes?
In most cases, the medical examiner doesn't have much difficulty determining the cause and manner of an individual's death. But Michelle Herndon's case was different.
At the end of the autopsy, I really had no idea. I didn't find anything slightly wrong whatsoever.
To find somebody that's deceased without any indication of what caused them to die, especially somebody that's that young, was highly unusual.
The medical examiner estimated that Michelle died about 24 hours before her body was found. So investigators interviewed everyone who was with Michelle during that time frame. They also checked the alibis of those closest to Michelle, including her fiancé.
Jason, squeaky clean. Jason had an alibi of being at work and was quickly removed as a potential suspect.
Then the medical examiner took a closer look at something on Michelle's left arm, a tiny mark, smaller than most needle marks.
We needed to find the explanation for that puncture wound, and there could be a very legitimate explanation for it.
But Michelle's personal physician said she didn't have any blood drawn before her death or receive any injections. So the medical examiner told investigators to widen their search at the crime scene, looking for possible evidence of drug use or an overdose.
In a case like this where we have no clues, every clue is significant.
Investigators noticed that the trash cans inside Michelle's apartment were empty. On a hunch, they looked outside the apartment to see where the trash was kept for disposal.
We went over to where the trash bins for that particular little community are stored. And on the ground, in a small plastic bag, I could see what was visible was a bottle, a pharmaceutical bottle. And I called the investigator over and said, "We got to look at this."
The bag contained 2 vials of a drug labeled propofol, some syringes, and a pediatric butterfly IV.
And it obviously had come from Michelle's house because contained within the bag was some mail that had been addressed to her.
To use a pediatric butterfly IV is tiny. It would leave a tiny little pinprick that would be very hard to discover.
The items were dusted for fingerprints, but none were found. Investigators needed to know what propofol was used for.
Propofol is, in a nutshell, the world's most powerful anti-breathing drug. In the medical setting, it's used by anesthesiologists to essentially put people to sleep.
Propofol, a prescription sedative, is an intravenous medication administered by medical professionals.
The kind of anesthetic that when it's administered, the anesthesiologist says count backward from 100 and you get to about 99. Very powerful stuff.
Too much propofol can cause death within seconds. Investigators asked that Michelle's toxicology tests be screened specifically for propofol.
It's highly unusual. We wouldn't typically see propofol in our drug screen. So we've never detected it in other cases.
As expected, tests were positive for propofol.
I can't say with specificity how much drug she got.
But one thing was clear. The dose was lethal.
The amount of drug that was administered was sufficient to cause someone to fall unconscious and to stop breathing.
To the medical examiner, it all started to make sense. Whoever it was used a pediatric-sized needle to make the tiny puncture wound in Michelle's left arm, since there was virtually no hemorrhaging.
All of those things were highly suggestive of somebody who has a lot of skill in this.
The medical examiner believed that this was the work of a medical professional, most likely someone who worked in a hospital and probably someone Michelle knew.
whoever had injected Michelle Herndon was someone that, for whatever the reasons were, she had trusted enough to offer that person her left arm.
She would not have been able to administer the dose and then clean up and take that medical waste the 60 feet from her body where it was located.
But who was this person? To find out, Detective Mark Woodmansee came up with an idea that changed the course of the investigation. He told analysts to test the syringe caps found in Michelle's trash.
I can remember seeing medical staff hold needle caps in their mouth while they were giving an injection, and I thought that there was a potential there for saliva DNA.
I thought that was rather brilliant, in fact.
DNA analysts swabbed the needle caps and found biological material.
On the needle cap or cover, there was an unknown male DNA profile.
And scientists also found DNA inside the syringe.
I was able to determine that Miss Herndon's DNA was present in one of them.
Proof it had been used on Michelle.
The substance that was found in the catheter was a mixture of Michelle's blood and propofol.
Michelle's death was now classified as a homicide, and the murder weapon was propofol.
I've never seen a propofol-related death, ever.
But who wanted Michelle dead? Michelle Herndon's death had been ruled a homicide. The cause of death, an overdose of the prescription drug propofol. Propofol is a short-acting intravenous sedative used in general anesthesia, but it's also used to treat other medical conditions.
Propofol has been suggested as a medication to treat migraines. It's not a clear indication or definitive indication to treat migraines, but it has been reported to be helpful to treat migraines.
Detectives learned that Michelle Herndon had been a lifelong migraine sufferer.
From what I understand, they were bad.
I've never had one, but people who suffer from these things tell me they're just absolutely horrible. They would go to the ends of the earth to get some relief from the pain.
Was it possible that Michelle had sought pain medication from someone other than her doctor?
They just wanted to know if Michelle knew anybody in the medical field. The only person I knew was Oliver.
Oliver was 30-year-old Oliver O'Quinn, an intensive care nurse at Shands Hospital on the campus of the University of Florida. A background check revealed Michelle and Oliver were casual friends.
I'd describe him as quirky, and odd is definitely a good adjective. There was just something about him, something that he felt like he had to go the extra mile to prove himself, where most people would just be themselves. The way he acted about Michelle, I kind of knew from when he first met her that he had had a crush on her.
I think she made comments to both her friends and her mother that he was weird and that she felt sorry for him.
Then police discovered some troubling information. A review of Michelle's phone record showed that O'Quinn's interest in Michelle bordered on harassment.
He had called Michelle Herndon 43 times in less than a month. And he had called Michelle Herndon every single day for 9 straight days preceding her murder. He never calls her again. He knows there's no one there to answer.
O'Quinn's job in the intensive care unit would have given him access to pediatric butterfly IVs like the ones found in Michelle's trash. Investigators wanted to see if they could link O'Quinn to the 2 bottles of propofol.
The important thing to me at this point is to track these drugs. Where did they come from? How can I put them in an individual's hand?
The vials of propofol have a national drug control number and a lot number.
Those specific bottles of propofol were shipped by McKesson distributors out of Lakeland, Florida.
From there, they were shipped to the Shands Hospital at the University of Florida.
They were shipped during the time period of when Oliver O'Quinn was employed there.
Specifically, they were placed in an automated dispensing machine in the hospital ICU.
I traced it to a machine that operates kind of like a soda machine. You punch in the patient number, and it drops a bottle of a pharmaceutical in your hand.
To get the propofol from the dispensing machine, a hospital employee had to enter his employee number. And whose code was entered to get these 2 vials? Registered nurse Oliver O'Quinn.
So I actually had that propofol all the way from the manufacturer in Massachusetts to Oliver O'Quinn's hand in the surgical intensive care unit at the hospital.
All investigators needed now was a sample of O'Quinn's DNA to compare to the DNA on the needle caps found in Michelle's trash. When police went to question him, they learned he had fled the country and was in Ireland, where he had applied for a nursing license.
He doesn't ever intend on coming back to the U.S. It's very difficult to extradite someone back from Ireland.
I spoke with the lady who is in charge of just extradition from the Republic of Ireland, and I told her, look, I've got a warrant in my hand. I want to arrest this man. And she said to me, and to the effect, slow down, Columbo. It's a very long process.
But what was O'Quinn's motive to kill Michelle? And would investigators find a way to get him back to the United States? Investigators had 2 problems in the murder of Michelle Herndon. First, they couldn't understand why their prime suspect, Oliver O'Quinn, would kill her. And second, O'Quinn had fled the United States to Ireland in order to avoid prosecution. To smoke him out, investigators contacted the Irish Times newspaper
and emailed them a picture of Michelle, a picture of Oliver, and a synopsis of the homicide investigation, and telling them he is wanted for murder in the United States. And they published it on 3 separate occasions.
Facing increasing pressure, O'Quinn left Ireland and flew to the West African country of Senegal, where he was immediately turned over to U.S. authorities. Once in custody, investigators got a court order to obtain O'Quinn's DNA sample, which was then compared to the DNA found on the syringe cap. It matched.
To me, I would equate that with getting the suspect's fingerprint off the trigger of the murder weapon.
Oliver made a great many mistakes, thank goodness.
Oliver O'Quinn was charged with first-degree murder. The only remaining question was motive.
I know he tried very hard to infuse himself into Michelle's life. And mostly out of pity and feeling sorry for him, she would bring him along to do things with, to go out to watch a band, to meet in the morning and have coffee.
But in custody, Oliver told a fellow inmate he grew angry with Michelle because he overheard her during a telephone conversation saying something unflattering about him.
She made some comments of a derogatory nature about Oliver O'Quinn, comments that she didn't expect for him to hear, but he did hear.
He heard Michelle refer to him as an annoying little man.
And we believe because of that, that sent him into this mindset that if you're never going to be mine, then you're never going to be anybody's.
And the inmate stated that Oliver confided to him that she needed a long sleep.
Prosecutors believe O'Quinn hatched a plan. He told Michelle the next time she had a migraine headache, he'd be willing to come to her apartment and give her something that would get rid of the pain quickly. The evidence shows he got the propofol from work, typing his employee number into the medication control system designed specifically to prevent this very abuse. Then he waited for Michelle to call. When she did, Oliver put his plan into action. On the night Michelle had the migraine, Oliver stopped by her apartment on his way home from work. He injected Michelle with a lethal dose of propofol using a small pediatric syringe. But he did something medical professionals often do, used his teeth to pull the plastic cap off the syringe and left behind the DNA that later identified him. Michelle was dead within seconds. He positioned her arm underneath her body so the needle mark wouldn't be easily noticeable. He threw the syringes and propofol bottles into a plastic bag, which he tossed into the dumpster behind Michelle's rented home, not realizing the obvious, that those serial numbers could be traced.
I believe that the pain was such that she entrusted Oliver O'Quinn to administer the pain reliever. And I think that he took advantage of that trust and intentionally took her life with the propofol.
Oliver O'Quinn went on trial for first-degree murder. His defense claimed he gave Michelle the propofol to help relieve the pain from her migraine headache, but accidentally gave her too much.
There's no way that the administration of propofol to Michelle Herndon was an accidental death. This was an action consistent with homicide.
The jury didn't believe it either. O'Quinn was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole.
This is the first reported case ever involving murder by the use of propofol. So this entire case was driven by and solved by forensics.
There was no eyewitness. So how do you put a person there without evidence? I mean, without the evidence, I don't think it would have worked.
Everybody did their job, and they did a great job, and it all came together.
I've never had a case where the small things mattered so much, where something as small as a needle mark or the amount of DNA left on a needle cap played such a pivotal role in the resolution of the case.
Before we get back to the episode, if you're listening on Spotify, please take a moment to tap 5 stars. It's one of the easiest ways to support Forensic Tales and helps the show reach new listeners. Thank you so much for being here.
To get this episode of Forensic Tales ad-free, please visit patreon.com/Forensic Tales.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
Gainesville was once a peaceful college community. Then one murder happened, then another, and another. Young female co-eds found themselves in the crosshairs of an unknown killer. The serial murders leave students questioning how and why. The shadow of terror grows larger and larger. Will the monster ever be caught? And is this a script from a movie or a grim tale of real-life horror? This is Forensic Tales, episode number 210, The Gainesville Ripper. Welcome to Forensic Tales. I'm your host, Courtney Fretwell Areola. Forensic Tales is a weekly true crime podcast covering real, spine-tingling stories with a forensic science twist. Some cases have been solved with forensic science, while others have turned cold. Every remarkable story sends us a chilling reminder that not all stories have happy endings. As a one-woman show, your support helps me find new compelling cases, conduct in-depth, fact-based research, and produce and edit this weekly show. You can support my work in 2 simple ways. Become a valued patron at patreon.com/Forensic Tales and leave a positive review. Before we get to the show, we've got 2 new Patreon supporters this week. Thank you so much to Sarah M. and John B. for becoming the show's newest supporters. Now, let's get to this week's episode. One of the most popular films of late 1996 and early 1997 was the horror movie Scream, a movie that features a ghost-faced killer who terrorized high school students. Scream became the world's highest-grossing slasher film. Because of its notoriety, Scream 2 was released only a year later. What many people don't know is that the movie franchise Scream isn't exactly original. In fact, the inspiration behind the multi-billion-dollar movie franchise is more disturbing than the movie itself. The entire franchise is largely based on true events. The Gainesville Ripper, a real-life serial killer who terrorized a Florida college town during a 3-day murderous rampage in the summer of 1990. The horror that happened during those 3 days inspired not only 6 movies, but also a television series, merchandise, and video games. On Sunday, August 26, 1990, the parents of 17-year-old Christina Powell became concerned when they hadn't heard from their daughter in a few days, which was completely out of character. So they decided to stop by her apartment in Gainesville, Florida. At the time, Christina and her 18-year-old roommate, Sonia Larson, shared an off-campus apartment and were both freshmen at the University of Florida in Gainesville, Florida. Classes were scheduled to begin the following day, on Monday, August 27th. So Christina's parents grew even more worried that something was wrong. They didn't want Christina to miss her very first day of school. When they got to the apartment, the first thing they did was knock on the door, but no one answered. So they knocked again. Still no answer. They decided to walk around the apartment complex until they ran into one of the building's maintenance workers. They explained who they were and asked the worker if they could let them inside the apartment so they could check on Christina. But the worker wasn't sure he was allowed to do that. Normally, they weren't allowed to go inside units unless they had a work order or specific permission from the resident. So the worker told Christina's parents he needed to go check with the property manager. But the manager also had his concerns. He told the parents that they should wait until the cops got there so they could perform a wellness check altogether. Several minutes later, the police arrived at the complex and went inside with the building's workers, while Christina's parents waited outside on the stairs. But within seconds of going inside, the maintenance worker came out running, screaming, and crying. Christina's parents immediately knew that something bad had happened. 17-year-old Christina Powell was found half naked lying on the living room floor of her apartment. She'd been stabbed 5 times in the back and had also been sexually assaulted. In the bedroom, they also found her roommate, 18-year-old Sonia Larson. Like Christina, she'd been stabbed to death. Both girls had been bound with duct tape. Sonia had a piece of duct tape over her mouth so that she couldn't scream. Christina's wrists were bound behind her back so she couldn't move or run away. There was evidence that whoever murdered these girls had wedged a screwdriver into the front door jamb to break in. But before he left, he took it with him. Based on the conditions of both bodies, the girls were likely killed anywhere between 48 and 72 hours before they were discovered, lining up with the last time that anyone heard from them. The murders of Sonia and Christina shocked the entire community. Gainesville was a big college town with thousands of young people living there, just like those 2 girls. So it was practically unheard of for 2 young college roommates to be found dead and murdered inside of their off-campus apartment. Police immediately investigated everyone close to them: boyfriends, friends, fellow University of Florida students. Anyone and everyone the girls knew were closely looked at by the police. But before they could get any solid leads in the case, another student turned up dead. 8 hours later, on the morning of Monday, August 27th, the police found 18-year-old Krista Hoyt dead inside her apartment, about 2 miles away from the first crime scene. Unlike Christina and Sonia, Krista wasn't a student at the University of Florida. Instead, She was taking classes at nearby Santa Fe Community College. The reason why the police showed up at her apartment was because she was an aspiring police officer. When she didn't show up for her midnight shift at the sheriff's department, her coworkers got worried and went to check on her. And that's when they discovered she'd been murdered. This also meant that some of her coworkers at the sheriff's department were among the first ones who found her body. Krista's apartment was almost identical to Christina's and Sonia's. A screwdriver had been used to break in through a window, and Christina had been stabbed, sexually assaulted, and her body had been posed while lying on the bed with her feet up in the air. By this point, there were 3 dead co-eds within only a few hours of one another. So not surprisingly, the murders started to attract widespread media attention. Every news station in the state covered the case. Everyone feared that a serial killer targeting college students was on the loose in Gainesville, a place completely foreign to the idea of serial killers. Throughout the day on Monday, August 27th, students at the University of Florida and Santa Fe Community College started taking extra precautions to protect themselves. Female students began asking campus security guards to walk with them to their cars at night. Others didn't go anywhere alone. Anyone who lived in an off-campus apartment complex was extra careful about locking their doors and windows. Some put heavy furniture in front of the doors and windows so that no one could break in without them hearing first. Some students even went as far as dropping out of class altogether. Since it was the first day of the fall semester, some decided to withdraw their admission and transfer to the other schools. The fear was just that real. Then later that night came victims number 4 and number 5. Tracy Paulus and Manny Taboado, both 23 years old and friends since high school, were found dead in a ground floor unit at the Gatorwood Apartments on the morning of Tuesday, August 28th, another off-campus student-friendly apartment complex in Gainesville. Manny, who was a student at the Santa Fe Community College, had defensive wounds on his hands, suggesting he tried to fight back before being stabbed to death. As a former high school football player, he was just the type of person to fight back. His roommate Tracy, a pre-law senior majoring in political science at the University of Florida, was found posed in the living room. She had been sexually assaulted, and there was evidence she had tape around her mouth and wrists, as well as soap on her lower body, maybe indicating her killer tried to wash away any evidence. A few days after victims 4 and 5, another couple was murdered about 17 miles away from Gainesville in the city of Melrose, Florida. Although the police were quick to figure out the murders weren't related, it still elevated the fear around the university. Based on how all victims died, the Gainesville police never questioned whether this was all done by the same person. In their minds, these murders were clearly all committed by the same person, or persons if they were looking for more than one. So the burning questions became, who was this person, or persons? Why were they targeting young college co-eds? And how many more victims would there be until this person was finally caught? Without a suspect, the murderer they were hunting simply became known as the Gainesville Ripper. There didn't appear to be too much randomness to the murders. It all seemed carefully calculated, and the victims were specifically targeted. With the exception of Manny, all of the victims were petite, white brunettes with brown eyes. They were all young college students, all lived in off-campus apartment complexes in the Gainesville area, so everything about the crimes screamed there was a connection, and the motives behind each one were similar. Something about college students interested this guy. In response to the murders, the University of Florida extended the deadline to add or drop classes through September 7th. They postponed tuition due dates and offered off-campus residents on-campus dorms if they wanted one. Some students felt safe on campus because the school had improved its security guard system and campus surveillance, which included the student dorms. This felt like a safe option for some of them because all the victims lived in an off-campus apartment building. There hadn't been any attacks inside the university's dorms. But every strange noise prompted a call to the police. Gun sales skyrocketed across local gun shops. Students who never thought about buying a weapon were now carrying around knives or mace for their protection. At the time, a lot of people were reminded of Ted Bundy, a serial killer whose cross-country reign of terror only came to an end after he'd beaten 2 Florida State University sorority sisters to death and killed a 12-year-old girl in the course of a month in 1978. So when people heard about the Gainesville murders, they couldn't help but worry if a Ted Bundy copycat was on the hunt. But the police did everything they could to ensure the public safety. They reminded people that Money magazine named Gainesville the 13th best city to live in the U.S. just earlier that year. Gainesville was an area that prided itself on having safe streets. It's not a place that breeds serial killers. But that wasn't enough reassurance to go around. Students at the University of Florida and nearby community college just didn't feel safe, and neither did their parents. No one was going to feel safe until this guy was caught. By the end of August, thousands of students left campus, and around 700 never returned because they feared for their lives. A multi-agency task force on top of the Gainesville Police Department was formed to try and track down the killer before there would be any more victims. The task force included local and state police working with federal agents specifically assigned to the case. Within days of the murders of Manny and his roommate Tracy, they had their first promising suspect. For the first time in over a week, the people of Gainesville felt a little bit of relief. His name was Edward Lewis Humphrey. At the time, Edward was a University of Florida student who lived in the same apartment complex as 2 of the victims. By all accounts, he seemed to fit the killer's profile. He was a student at the university, so he would have known the locations of pretty much all off-campus housing. He was the right age, not too old or too young. He had a history of mental illness that the police were convinced had something to do with the murders. And he also had a history of what many people described as, quote, erratic behavior. He even looked the part. His face was covered in scars and marks from a previous car accident. And the best part was, he was already in jail by the time police identified him as a suspect in the Gainesville murders. He'd been arrested for physically assaulting his own grandma. So Edward also had a violent side. All of those factors pointed toward Edward Humphrey as public enemy number 1. When the police zeroed in on Edward, his photo was everywhere. The local media began reporting that the Gainesville killer had been arrested. Local and national newspapers started running the story, and news traveled everywhere. Since Edward was already in custody for assaulting his grandma, the police were able to search his home and car, looking for any evidence connected to the murders. They also took his fingerprints, hair, and DNA samples to compare against the evidence collected at the crime scenes. While Edward was in custody, the murders suddenly stopped, which only led people to believe even more that they had the right guy. Over the next several months, Edward Humphrey remained in custody. The students of the University of Florida slowly regained their confidence. Edward was charged and convicted of assaulting his grandma during this time and was sentenced to 10 months behind bars. About 5 months after his arrest, the authorities assembled a grand jury to decide if there was enough evidence to charge Edward with the Gainesville murders. And they considered everything: Edward's violent past and issues with mental health, his proximity to the off-campus apartment complex where the murders took place, Even the hair and DNA samples the police collected from him were compared to those found at the crime scenes. But after all the evidence was considered and the grand jury had a chance to look at everything, they shocked everyone. They cited a lack of evidence in the case and decided not to charge Edward for any of the murders. Simply put, none of his DNA or hair matched the forensic evidence collected at any of the crime scenes. So although they considered him a prime suspect for over 5 months in the case, there was virtually no physical evidence proving he was the guy. So after he served his 10-month sentence for assaulting his grandma, Edward Humphrey was released from jail, and he was never officially charged in any of the Gainesville murders. But if Edward Humphrey didn't do it, who did? And why did they suddenly stop right when he was arrested? Once Edward was a free man again, the hunt for the real Gainesville Ripper only heated up. The task force conducted hundreds of interviews, sifted through more than 18,000 pieces of evidence, ran DNA samples, and tracked the flood of tips phoned in by those who were sure they had crossed paths with the killer. But none of this had any effect on the progress of the investigation, until the authorities received a phone call from someone in Louisiana. A police officer with the Louisiana Police Department called the authorities in Gainesville, Florida, and said they thought they were on to something. According to this Louisiana police officer, 3 people had been murdered in the town of Shreveport on November 4th, 1989, and while investigating the case, they saw a lot of similarities between that case and the unsolved Gainesville College murders. Louisiana police were referring to the unsolved murders of 55-year-old Tom Grissom, his 24-year-old daughter Julie, and his 8-year-old grandson Sean. All 3 of them had been brutally murdered inside their home while preparing dinner. An intruder broke into the house and attacked all 3 of them. Afterward, Julie's body was found to have been mutilated, cleaned, and posed, similar to some of the Gainesville victims. Even though investigators in Louisiana tried everything to catch the killer, they were at a dead end. But when they heard about the unsolved murders in Florida, they thought they might be connected. The 8 murders shared similarities, which included the posing of the victims, tape residue on some of the victims' bodies, and vinegar to clean the bodies. Detectives in Louisiana were able to collect unknown DNA found at the crime scene in Shreveport and discovered that the killer had type B blood, another critical similarity to the killer in Gainesville. Detectives were headed in the right direction, but before they could do anything with the unknown DNA, the police received a tip that changed everything. Not long after the police connected the dots between the unsolved murders in Louisiana and Florida, they received a tip from someone working the phones at a local Crime Stoppers organization in Louisiana. A woman called in claiming to know the person behind all 8 murders, or at least she knew of someone the police should investigate. A guy named Danny Rolling. According to the caller, a local resident of Shreveport, Danny Rolling might be the guy they were after. She said about 3 months earlier, in August 1990, she was traveling in Florida and heard about the college kid murders up in Gainesville, Florida, from Danny Rolling himself. She told Crime Stoppers she and her husband had met Danny at their church, and during their short relationship, Danny shared some extremely disturbing things with them. Danny would come over almost every night, and during some of these visits, he would talk about hurting people, or at least wanting to hurt people. He went as far as talking about the knife he would use. Eventually, this woman and her husband decided they didn't want Danny Rolling coming over to their house anymore. They weren't sure if he was telling the truth about anything that he talked about, like stabbing or hurting people. But the whole thing just freaked them out, so they told Danny he wasn't welcome anymore. Then they heard about the 3 murders in their hometown of Louisiana. Her first thought was that Danny Rolling might have been involved. So she decided to pick up the phone and call Crime Stoppers to give them Danny's name. She didn't have any physical proof that he was responsible, but deep down in her gut, she just knew. Once the police got Danny's name from Crime Stoppers, they looked into him as much as possible. They quickly found out that he had already been arrested on September 7th, 1990, in Ocala, Florida, for an armed robbery. During that particular incident, Danny used a gun to try and rob a Winn-Dixie grocery store in Ocala, but was ultimately caught after a chase with the police. This robbery happened 10 days after Manny and his roommate Tracy were murdered. So that could explain why the murders suddenly stopped at the same exact time they arrested the first suspect, Edward Humphrey. Danny was in jail, so that's why there weren't any more murders in Gainesville. Since Danny was already in jail on unrelated charges, it was easy for investigators to get a sample of his DNA. They didn't even need a search warrant. So once they had a DNA sample, they compared it to the DNA collected at all the crime scenes throughout Gainesville and the one in Louisiana. Through an extracted tooth, investigators were able to match Danny's DNA to all the unknown DNA at the murder scenes. Danny Rolling was the Gainesville Ripper. As soon as they had the DNA evidence, Danny Rolling became the primary suspect in all 8 murders. Police immediately went to question him. And then, Danny did something shocking. He confessed to everything. He admitted to the Gainesville murders almost immediately. In fact, he was almost proud that he was the infamous Gainesville Ripper. So right after his confession, the authorities didn't waste a single second filing criminal charges. In November 1999, Danny Rolling, the man once known as the Gainesville Ripper, was charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder. If convicted, he was facing the death penalty. Although Rolling had confessed to the murders and DNA put him at the crime scenes, it would take another 4 years before he was convicted and sentenced. But during this time, everyone got a glimpse into who the Gainesville Ripper really was. Born Danny Harold Rolling on May 26, 1954, to Claudia and James Rolling in Shreveport, Louisiana, Danny's life didn't start good. Although his parents were married when he was born, his father, James Rolling, never seemed to either be wanting to be a father or a husband. He was a police officer and was reported to have abused both his wife and children over and over again. In fact, the first time Danny's father abused him was when he was only 1 year old. He was beaten because his dad didn't think that he was crawling the right way. And when Kevin, Danny's younger brother, was born in 1955, the abuse only got worse. It was reported that Danny's mom, Claudia, tried to leave the marriage several times because of the abuse, but for one reason or another, she always came back, and the abuse cycle simply kept repeating. By the time Danny started 3rd grade, he was already failing in school. He either didn't turn in his homework or he wasn't showing up to school because of repeated illnesses, and during this time, his mom suffered a mental breakdown. Danny's teachers in school described him as, quote, suffering from an inferiority complex with aggressive tendencies and poor impulse control, end quote. As a child, those aggressive tendencies and poor impulse control seemed to forecast the kind of person Danny Rolling was becoming. He tried joining the Navy as an adult, but they wouldn't take him, so he went to the Air Force instead. But not even the military could provide the kind of support and structure he needed. So he quit the Air Force after doing too many drugs, which included doing acid more than 100 times. After his discharge from the military, Danny Rolling seemed to live a normal life, at least for a little while. He got married and settled into a regular job. But the normalcy didn't last. and the abuse cycle started over again. At only 23 years old, Danny's wife accused him of abusing her and threatening to kill her. So she left him, and he went out and reportedly sexually assaulted another woman who was said to look exactly like his ex-wife. Then, after that first sexual assault incident, the real making of the Gainesville Ripper began. From the late 1970s to the 1990s, he committed a series of petty crimes and theft. He usually turned to armed robberies when he ran out of money and needed cash. So during this time, he was in and out of jail all across Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, and Alabama. He somehow managed to break out of jail several times, but always found himself locked up again. Even on the outside, he couldn't make ends meet. He would get hired and quickly either get fired or quit the job before the employer had a chance to fire him. In May 1990, Danny broke into his father's house where he shot him twice, almost killing him. Although he survived, his dad lost an eye and an ear. After that episode, he changed his identity with papers he stole from breaking into someone's house. He left Louisiana with his new identity and moved to Florida to start a new life as Michael Kennedy Jr. in July 1990. But once again, running away didn't make life any better for him. Instead, it only made his situation worse. About a month after he moved to Sarasota, Florida, he broke into the apartment of Sonia and Christina, the first Gainesville victims, in August 1990. From then on, he went on his week-long killing spree all across Gainesville, and eventually became known as the Gainesville Ripper. When Danny first broke into Sonia and Christina's apartment, he found Christina asleep on the couch. But instead of waking her up, he went upstairs to Sonia's room where she was also asleep. He then put duct tape over her mouth so Christina wouldn't be able to hear her scream. And then he stabbed her to death. After Sonia was dead, he went back downstairs where he confronted Christina on the couch in the living room. He taped her mouth shut with tape and bound her ankles and wrists before stabbing her 5 times. Before leaving the apartment, he did 2 things. 1, he took a shower, and 2, he posed both of their bodies. When it came to his second victim, 18-year-old Krista Hoyt, he was able to break into her place through the sliding glass door using a screwdriver. But when he got inside, Krista wasn't home. The place was completely empty. So he decided to wait in the living room. Hours later, around 11 a.m., Krista returned to her apartment where she was immediately caught off guard by Danny standing in her living room. He put her in a chokehold, and then, just like the first 2 girls, he put duct tape over her mouth and bound both her ankles and wrists behind her back. After he sexually assaulted and killed her, he left the apartment. But not long after that, he realized he forgot his wallet. So he went back inside, and not only did he find his wallet, but he also decided to use that opportunity to almost decapitate Krista and pose her body before leaving the apartment again. When Danny Rolling broke into the 3rd apartment where Manny and Tracy lived, he encountered the most trouble he had so far because both of them fought back. Manny physically fought him, and Tracy tried to barricade herself in the bedroom when she found out what was happening. But neither one of them was successful, and before leaving, Manny's body was left where he was killed, and Tracy's body was posed. After spending 4 years in jail, Danny Rolling was finally brought to trial for the murders. At the trial, he claimed his motive was simple. He wanted to be just like his idol, serial killer Ted Bundy. According to his very own words, he wanted to become, quote, a superstar just like Bundy. But before the trial could really get anywhere, Danny Rolling pleaded guilty to all charges against him, And on April 20th, 1994, Rolling was sentenced to death for his role as the Gainesville Ripper. 12 years later, the state of Florida carried out its plan to execute Rolling. On October 25th, 2006, the day he was scheduled to die by lethal injection, he finally confessed to his part in the Shreveport murders. He also gave the authorities a handwritten confession and apology letter. After he ate his last meal, which consisted of lobster tails, he was led to the execution room. He was allowed to say any last words, but he didn't. He didn't say a single word. In the last moment, the U.S. Supreme Court had the opportunity to stop the execution, but they didn't. They rejected his last appeal. And by 6:15 p.m. that night, Danny Rolling was pronounced dead. Florida executed the Gainesville Ripper. Danny Rolling, known as the Gainesville Ripper, terrorized college students during a 3-day murderous rampage until DNA was finally able to tie him to all the crimes. He left behind valuable forensic evidence. He may have been executed, but what he did that summer in 1990 has lived on through one of the most popular slasher film franchises, Scream. It's sometimes sad to say, but life can be stranger than fiction. To share your thoughts on the story, be sure to follow the show on Instagram and Facebook. To find out what I think about the case, sign up to become a patron at patreon.com/forensictales. After each episode, I release a bonus episode where I share my personal thoughts and opinions about the case. Don't forget to subscribe to Forensic Tales so you don't miss an episode. We release a new episode every Monday. If you love the show, consider leaving us a positive review or tell friends and family about us. You can also help support the show through Patreon. Thank you so much for joining me this week. Please, join me next week. We'll have a brand new case and a brand new story to talk about. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings. Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell Areola. For a small monthly contribution, you can help create new compelling cases for the show, help fund research, and assist with production and editing costs. For supporting the show, you'll become one of the first to listen to new ad-free episodes and snag exclusive show merchandise not available anywhere else. To learn about how you can support the show, head over to our Patreon page, patreon.com/forensictales, or simply click the support link in the show notes. You can also support the show by leaving a positive review or telling friends and family about us. Forensic Tales is a podcast made possible by our Patreon producers, Tony A., Nicole G., Christine B., Karen D., Nancy H., Sherry A., Michael D., Nicola, Jerry M., Brian W., Natasha K., Jerry L., and Megan G. If you'd like to become a producer of the show, head over to our Patreon page or send me an email at courtney@forensictales.com to find out how you could become involved. For a complete list of sources used in this episode, please visit forensictales.com. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings. Before we get back to the episode, if you're listening on Spotify, please take a moment to tap 5 stars. It's one of the easiest ways to support Forensic Tales and helps the show reach new listeners. Thank you so much for being here. To enjoy this episode of Forensic Tales ad-free, check us out on Patreon. Patreon.com/forensictales.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
The death of UK spy Gareth Williams in 2010 has become one of the most high-profile unsolved mysteries in years after his naked body was discovered padlocked inside a duffel bag. Described as a genius mathematician who the intelligence service had recruited, Gareth's exact cause of death remains unknown, and people can't agree whether he could have locked himself in there on his own or whether someone else was responsible. There have been a number of theories over the years, including sex games gone wrong and Russian spies. But even today, there are still so many unanswered questions about his death. What happened to him, and how can forensic science help us find those answers? This is Forensic Tales, The Mysterious Death of Gareth Williams. Our case this week takes us to the UK. Been on my mind to cover a case from there, and from the moment I heard about this story, I knew I wanted to do it. Before we dive deep into all the details of this story, I think this case comes down to one very important question. Was this murder or was it an accident? There will be a lot of other questions along the way, like was someone else inside of his flat when he died? Was there a massive government cover-up? Did his death have anything to do with his work as a code breaker? Are the Russians somehow involved? But the main question everyone's been trying to answer over the last 2 decades is this: was this murder? To be honest, this is a pretty long and complicated story. There's a lot of information out there, including a lot of different theories. So this episode might be a little bit longer than usual. And if you've never heard about this case, you probably already have so many questions just from hearing the intro. A British spy found naked and dead inside of a duffel bag, a story that has been widely referred to as Spy in the Bag case. I know, that's why I wanted to cover this one. But because it is a long and complicated story, I'm going to go through it a little differently than how I usually do, in hopes of making it as straightforward as possible. The first thing we'll talk about are the specifics of the case, who Gareth Williams was, a little bit about his childhood, as well as his journey to becoming a junior analyst for GCHQ, and then eventually working for MI6, how his body was found inside of that duffel bag in 2010, the subsequent investigation by the Secret Intelligence Service and the Metropolitan Police, the coroner's inquest in 2012, the Metropolitan Police's reinvestigation in 2013, the developments involving Russia in 2015, and the review of the forensic evidence in 2024. After that, we'll talk about all of the forensic evidence, what there is and what there isn't in this case, and all of the different theories out there. Then, at the very end, I'll leave the question of murder up to you. You can come up with your own conclusions about what you think happened. Also, I know many of my listeners come from the US, so I'll do my best to explain what all of the different agencies are and what the process looks like in the UK. Again, I'll do my best with all of that since I'm from the US as well. With all of that being said, let's start with who Gareth Williams was and his journey to the Secret Intelligence Service. August 20th, 2010, an area of central London in the city of Westminster. The police were called to a top-floor flat located at 36 Alderney Street to perform a welfare check on the person living there, 31-year-old Gareth Williams. Originally from Wales and born to parents Ian and Ellen Williams with a younger sister named Carrie, Gareth can't be described as anything but brilliant. He might have also been shy and modest, but he was certainly smart. For someone who would eventually be described as a genius, it shouldn't come as too much of a surprise
that Gareth really excelled in school as a kid, with his favorite subject being math. When he was just 16 years old and still in secondary school, he was already taking classes at the university, working part-time towards his math degree. He eventually graduated with his degree in mathematics and moved to England so he could work on a PhD in computer science at the University of Manchester. That's where he got the attention of the Government Communications Headquarters, or GCHQ, an intelligence and security organization responsible for providing signals intelligence and information assurance to the government and armed forces of the UK. The GCHQ felt so strongly about his potential, they agreed to sponsor him while he worked toward his postgraduate degree. He was just the kind of person that the GCHQ would look for. But even the world's most brilliant people don't always succeed in everything that they do. In 2001, he failed an exam and decided to drop out of his program at St. Catherine's College in Cambridge. And instead of continuing his courses, he took a job as a cryptologist at the GCHQ. His job was to intercept radio and internet communications and attempt to break the code. He worked at their headquarters and rented out a room. Outside of math and his job at the GCHQ, he was an avid cyclist who loved to compete in bike races and was a member of a few local cycling clubs. He was described as quiet, polite, reserved, and very private. He wasn't very social. So when he wasn't at work or he wasn't riding his bike, he was usually at home by himself. After working for the GCHQ for about 8 years, Gareth was sent on a 3-year secondment to the Secret Intelligence Service, also referred to as MI6 or SIS. For my US listeners, MI6 is the Foreign Intelligence Service of the UK, tasked primarily with covert overseas collection and analysis of human intelligence on foreign nationals in support of its Five Eyes partners. It's one of the British intelligence agencies, and the chief of the Secret Intelligence Service is directly accountable to the Foreign Secretary. In other words, to have a job like this would be a pretty big deal. So in 2009, he moved to London and rented the top floor flat of a townhouse on Alderney Street, the place where the police would eventually do the welfare check. It was also a place used to house some of the security services staff. The place should have been perfect for him. It was only about a half-mile from the MI6 headquarters, and it was in a nice neighborhood. But as we're about to talk about, Gareth didn't seem to be too happy there. For about the next 12 months, he worked for MI6 and lived in that building. But no one, not even his own family, really knew what he did for work. But that makes sense. Given the secret nature of his position, he never told anyone what exactly he was doing, and no one asked. By the summer of 2010, he seemed to have changed his mind about working for MI6 and requested to get his job back at the GCHQ. He requested to end his assignment 2 years earlier than expected. Some reports say it was because he didn't like the culture at the MI6 like he had at the GCHQ. People at MI6 were much more social, while Gareth Williams wasn't. He was the quiet type who liked to keep to himself. So he called his former landlord and asked if he could move back into the same building that he had lived for almost a decade. But before he could return to this job at the GCHQ, one of his final assignments for MI6 was to attend DEF CON in the US, an annual convention for hackers held in Las Vegas, Nevada each year. So in early August 2010, Gareth traveled to the US and attended the conference. After that, he remained in Las Vegas for a few days on leave before returning to London on August 11th. And that's really where the mystery of this story begins. He was scheduled to return to work at the MI6 building on Monday, August 16th, but he never showed up and he would never be seen alive again. 1 week later, on Monday, August 23rd, the GCHQ received a frantic phone call from his sister, Carrie, saying she hadn't heard from her brother in several days. In fact, she hadn't heard from him since he returned to London 12 days earlier. But Carrie wasn't the only one. Apparently, no one at either MI6 or GCHQ had either. He hadn't shown up to work all week long. So later that day, one of Garrett's managers placed a phone call to the Metropolitan Police to see if they would perform a welfare check at his flat to make sure that everything was okay. It wasn't like him to miss an entire week of work without telling anyone. Now, before moving on, I want you to remember those details. His sister Carrie hadn't heard from him in 12 days. He just got back from the United States. He missed a week of work and never called his supervisors, but no one at work reported him missing to the police until his sister called. It's a little surprising that the welfare check wasn't done earlier. We know this was completely out of character. He wasn't the type to miss work. He was, by all accounts, a very dedicated employee. So why wouldn't any of his supervisors or coworkers say anything earlier? If it were me who went missing, I would hope that someone would call the police long before a week has passed. But that's what happened here. So on Monday, August 23rd, 2 officers with the Metropolitan Police showed up at Garrett's flat, but they could have never imagined what they were about to walk into. That brings us to the duffel bag. The first thing the police officers noticed was how hot it was. Despite the already warm August temperatures, Garrett's flat was especially hot because someone had left the heater on full blast. We'll be talking about this more once we get to the coroner's inquest. The second thing that was off, the smell. There was a strong odor coming from the main bathroom. It was the unmistakable smell of death that anyone would recognize a mile away if you've ever smelt it. The 2 Metropolitan Police officers walked around the flat, calling out Garrett's name, but no one answered. So they walked toward where the smell was coming from, the master bathroom. When they got there, the door was shut, lights were off, and the shower curtain was completely shut. But when they pulled back the curtain, inside the small tub, there was a red vinyl 32 by 19-inch North Face sports bag, padlocked shut from the outside. The padlock went through the bag's zipper, securing the bag completely shut. The officers cut open the bag, and inside was Gareth. He was completely naked, lying in the fetal position with the key to the padlock underneath one of his legs. So that's the scene. The heater had been left on for days. The shower curtain was closed, covering the bag, and Gareth was inside the locked bag, stark naked with the lights turned out. So at 4:48 p.m., the flat was officially declared a crime scene. Now the autopsy. Based on the level of decomposition, the coroner estimated that he died about 7 to 10 days before he was found. So that means he was stuffed inside of that locked duffel bag inside the bathtub for a week, explaining why the flat smelt so bad. The coroner's estimate on the time of death also lines up with his work and his sister's stories. Gareth had been absent all week from work, and none of his family members had heard from him since returning from the U.S. But determining his exact cause of death wasn't as easy. Obviously, his death was suspicious. MI6 spy being found naked, dead, stuffed inside of a locked duffel bag, that automatically screams suspicious. But it wasn't immediately clear what happened to him. They just knew that he had been dead for several days at this point and showed major signs of decomposition. The amount of time spent in the bag, plus the hot temperatures in the flat from the heater being turned on, rapidly caused his body to decay. Early news reports falsely stated that Gareth had been stabbed and they labeled his death a homicide. But those reports simply weren't accurate. He didn't have any stab wounds, and besides a few minor abrasions to one of his elbows, he didn't have any injuries, and there was no drugs, no alcohol in his system. There was nothing suspicious found at the autopsy, despite being locked inside of a gym bag. Later on, the authorities suspected those abrasions on his arm could have gotten there from him moving his arms inside of the bag during a possible attempt at getting out, but that can't be confirmed. It wasn't initially clear who should handle the investigation, the Metropolitan Police or MI6. He's someone who worked for the Secret Intelligence Service, so he's not an ordinary citizen, and the facts of the case are simply bizarre. However, after a meeting between these two agencies, it was decided that the Metropolitan Police's Counterterrorism Command, or SO-15, should be in charge. But it wasn't just a debate between these two agencies. After finding out about what happened, the U.S. State Department got involved, saying that no details of Gareth's work should be made public. They got involved because Gareth had worked with the U.S. National Security Agency and FBI agents in the past. At one point, even the FBI conducted their own investigation into the case. So it seems like his death wasn't just an issue for the UK, it captured our attention as well. Deciding what agency should lead the investigation was only the beginning. The next step was to figure out exactly what type of case this was. A homicide? Suicide? An accident? But the answer to that question isn't as straightforward as you might think. From the start, almost nothing about this case made any sense. So now let's discuss the initial investigation by the SO-15 or the Metropolitan Police's Counterterrorism Command. I mentioned just a few moments ago that there were no injuries on his body and no signs that he had been involved in a struggle. He had no alcohol or drugs in his system, and there was nothing unusual about the autopsy, no obvious causes of death. The flat itself was also fairly unremarkable. There were no signs of forced entry. The place was clean, with no indication of a struggle. And while very little about his position with MI6 has been made public, his position was deemed to be low risk. Another strange detail about the flat was that nothing appeared to have been stolen. Everything valuable was found sitting out in the open, including multiple cell phones and a laptop that was laid out neatly on a table in the living room. And although no data on his laptops or cell phones revealed anything suspicious, one of his iPhones had been reset to factory settings right before his death. This happened at approximately 11:54 p.m. on August 15th. There was also a recent search on his laptop lasting around 90 minutes for a cycling club in the area at 1:03 a.m. on August 16th. So at this point, the Metropolitan Police considered his death, quote, suspicious and unexplained, but wouldn't elaborate on many details. This episode of Forensic Tales is brought to you by Lola Blankets. I'll admit it, I'm a total blanket person. After my toddler is in bed, my wind-down routine always looks the same. A true crime doc on, tea in hand, and me wrapped in my Lola blanket. I have the large in cosmic gray, and from the second I opened it, I was obsessed. It's ultra soft, luxurious, and instantly made my space feel cozy. Honestly, I don't even touch my old blankets anymore. Lola is the world's #1 blanket for a reason. Crafted with luxury vegan faux fur and their signature 4-way stretch, it's machine washable, durable, and somehow just gets better after every wash. For a limited time, my listeners are getting a huge 35% off their entire order at lolablankets.com by using code TALES at checkout. Just head to lolablankets.com and use code TALES for 35% off. After your purchase, they will ask you where you heard about them. Please support my show and tell them that I sent you. Wrap yourself in luxury with Lola Blankets. This time of year can be rough. The holidays are near and they're supposed to be joyful, but for so many, they bring stress about food, weight, and body image. Add in all the talk around weight loss medications, and it can feel overwhelming to know what's best for you. That's why Hers is here to support your journey so that you can feel your best.
If prescribed, you get medications as part of a doctor-developed weight loss program, complete with ongoing care, check-ins, dosage, and medication adjustments, and access to 24/7 online support at no additional cost. No hidden fees and no membership fees. Whether you want to lose weight, grow thicker, fuller hair, or find relief for anxiety, Hers has you covered. Visit forhers.com/tales to get a personalized, affordable plan that gets you. That's forhers.com/tales. forhers.com/tales. Weight loss by Hers is not available everywhere. Compounded drug products are not approved or evaluated for safety, effectiveness, or quality by the FDA. Prescription required. See website for full details, important safety information, and restrictions. Actual price depends on product and plan purchased.
The authorities knew Gareth had recently traveled to the U.S. to attend that conference in Las Vegas. So they tried searching for any CCTV footage of him once he returned to the UK. And here's what they uncovered. CCTV showed him entering the Holland Park tube station at around 3 p.m. on August 14th. He was also captured going into a department store in Knightsbridge and walking towards Sloane Street between 2 and 2:30 p.m. on the 15th. Then the last known CCTV footage of him was around 3 o'clock that afternoon, showing him walking down Alderney Street toward his flat carrying 2 bags. After that, he's never seen again. And nothing about the footage explains anything. He's not doing anything strange, and no one appears to be following him. So here's the timeline so far. He was captured on camera walking back to his flat at around 3 o'clock on the 15th. Assuming he made those internet searches on his laptop for that cycling club at 1:03 a.m. on August 16th, we know he's still alive at that point. We also don't know if he was the one who reset one of his iPhones to its factory settings, but let's assume that it was, because that happened right before the internet searches. Then he never showed up to work like he was supposed to later that morning. So whatever happened to him happened during this small window of time. There were no more internet searches on his laptop, no cell phone activity on any of his 4 known cell phones, no CCTV footage of him leaving, nothing until his body was discovered a week later, or at least not that we know of. It would be about a month before Gareth's body was returned to his family so that he could have a proper burial and funeral, which was held on September 26, 2010. It was a mostly private service attended by family, close friends, and a few colleagues in the intelligence services. At the same time his family mourned their loss, the SO-15 were still busy searching for answers. But would they ever find them? This now brings us to December 2010. 4 months after Gareth's death, the SO-15 released a lot more details about his personal life. And as we're about to find out, these details ignited a media circus. The first detail they released was that on one of his cell phones, they found several searches for bondage websites. There weren't a lot of them suggesting that he was doing it all of the time, but there was enough evidence suggesting that he visited these types of bondage websites, quote, occasionally. He would usually spend about 30 minutes to an hour on them. These were described as sites showing people bound and tied together, including do-it-yourself guides. But searching the web was all that he did. No bondage equipment was ever found in his flat, and he didn't have anything else suggestive like pornography. Now, here's something else interesting about his life that was released in December. Inside Gareth's flat, the authorities recovered about 25,000 pounds of what has been described as high-end women's clothing. These were items found inside of his closet that were organized into 6 different boxes. He had dozens of women's designer dresses, women's boots, shoes, wigs, makeup. None of these items were things that you would expect to find in a single man's closet. Plus, we're not talking about 1, 2, or even 3 of these types of items. We're talking about thousands of pounds of women's clothing. It was a large collection. So not surprisingly, this led many British newspapers to publish wild and salacious stories saying things like he liked to dress in women's clothing, he was a cross-dresser, he was gay. But these were all unfounded stories. There's simply no definitive evidence suggesting that he was a cross-dresser, gay, or anything else. In fact, there's probably more evidence suggesting the opposite. Almost all of the clothes and wigs still had the tags on them like they had never been worn before. There also might be several explanations as to why he had them in the first place. We know that Gareth enrolled in 2 fashion design courses at Central St. Martin's College a couple of years before. So some of the items could have been related to those courses. The idea behind this explanation is that he just really enjoyed fashion trends and he kept them. Again, the tags hadn't been removed. When it came time for his family to weigh in on this is what his sister Carrie told the media. She said that most of the clothing and shoes were much too small for her brother, and she thought he bought them for someone else, another woman. Although there's no evidence suggesting he had a girlfriend at the time. But it's also worth mentioning here that receipts found inside of the flat showed that he had been purchasing these items over the course of about 2 years before his death. The other story the British tabloids ran with was that Gareth was gay. This came after a witness told the police that he saw Gareth several times at a local gay bar. But it's unclear whether he was actually gay or not. Some reports I found say that he was. Some say that he wasn't. The witness who said he saw them at these gay bars, saw him, doesn't remember seeing anyone with him, male or female. And you don't have to be gay to go to a gay bar. Now, those aren't the only explanations for the women's clothing. The police revealed that Gareth had visited a drag show in East London just 4 days before he died. He also had tickets to attend 2 more upcoming drag shows. So it's possible the women's clothing had something to do with that. Well, whether he bought them for those college courses, the drag shows, or whatever else, this news only led to more and more public speculation and rumors. It was already a very bizarre story, but now it's quickly become a media circus in the British newspapers. However, I want to mention here, his family and friends completely refute all of these claims, pointing toward his reserved nature and his fascination with fashion design. So as of now, we don't really know what the clothing or the wigs mean. When we get to the theory section, we'll talk about them again. Let's circle back to the bondage websites, because there was something else about his personal life revealed in December 2010. According to Gareth's former landlady, she and her husband had once found him shouting for help with his hands tied to his bedpost in 2007. She was his landlady for almost 10 years, so she knew him pretty well. She said when they got inside of his flat, he was lying on the bed, dressed only in a pair of boxer shorts. After they cut him free from the ties, Gareth reportedly said that he had tied himself up like that just to see if he could get free. But the former landlady and her husband didn't seem to really believe that. They thought the situation had some type of sexual element behind it, rather than just Gareth saying that he wanted to see if he could break free, although that's not something that he directly admitted to. Again, this will be something else that we talk about a little bit later on when we get down to the theories. During the early part of the investigation, the police put out an EFIT, or electronic facial identification technique, of 2 people that they needed help identifying. They were a man and a woman who appeared to be in their 20s or early 30s, who had supposedly visited Garrett's townhouse in the months before his death. They were said to be of Mediterranean descent. So they released photos of this couple's in hopes of identifying them and finding out whether they had anything to do with his death or not. But eventually, the couple was positively identified and they were deemed to have nothing to do with it. Another thing we'll talk about a little bit later on. Following the initial police investigation, not much happened. All the public knew was that the Metropolitan Police considered his death, quote, suspicious and unexplained. But other than that, no details were made public, and no one knew his exact cause of death. However, the police's silence didn't stop his family from wanting answers. They suspected their son had been murdered, and now his death was all part of a cover-up, even suggesting a fellow British spy could have done it. That now brings us to 2012, the coroner's inquest. Garrett's family had long suspected that someone else was inside his flat when he died, and there was no way he could have gotten himself into that duffel bag all on his own. They also accused the police of possibly tampering with the forensic evidence. Don't worry, we'll get to that. So in 2012, a coroner's inquest was initiated, and this is what happened. Once again, for my U.S. listeners, a coroner's inquest is a formal investigation into the circumstances of someone's death. It's the fact-finding process that determines someone's exact cause and manner of death. The coroner's inquest was led by Dr. Fiona Wilcox and lasted over a week with over 30 witnesses. And this is what she ruled. She believes Garrett's death was, quote, unnatural and likely to have been criminally mediated. She was also, quote, satisfied that on the balance of probabilities that Garrett was killed unlawfully, but it is unlikely authorities will ever unwind the exact circumstances of his death. Here's her explanation. Although Dr. Wilcox said that it remained, quote, a legitimate line of inquiry that the Secret Services may have been involved in his death, she stopped short of suggesting that fellow spies killed him, emphasizing that there was no evidence that he had been murdered by one of his own. She did, however, criticize the police for how they handled the investigation. Dr. Wilcox criticized them for failing to report him missing for over 7 days, which not only caused more anguish for his family, but also could have led to the loss of very important forensic evidence. If they reported him missing sooner, then maybe we would have more answers than we do. This was also why the family suspects that they might have tampered with evidence. If they had an entire week to go in and out of his flat, what could they have done with the evidence during that time? This was a detail from earlier in the episode that I wanted you to remember. Garrett's work didn't report him missing until his family called, even though they knew that he failed to show up to work. Coroner Wilcox was also highly critical of SO15, who failed to inform the senior investigating officer before the inquest began of the existence of 9 memory sticks found inside of Garrett's work locker inside the MI6 building. As of today, the contents of these memory sticks remains a mystery because they haven't been made public, so we can only speculate about their importance. Other criticisms were, number 1, a DNA mix-up made by the police's forensics team. DNA found on Garrett's hand turned out to be contaminated by one of the forensic scientists, so it was useless. Second, the pursuit of leads leading nowhere. The police spent weeks tracking down that Mediterranean couple seen around Garrett's townhouse that we talked about earlier, but they had nothing to do with it. It was a complete waste of time and resources in an already difficult investigation. Number 3, the MI6's delay in handing evidence over to Scotland Yard. For example, Garrett's GCHQ computer wasn't handed over until 6 days after his body was discovered, and the MI6 one 4 days later. Finally, number 4, the fact his coworkers who failed to report him missing never gave formal statements as part of the investigation. Why wouldn't his coworkers be interviewed as part of the initial investigation? So the inquest didn't say there was any solid proof that a fellow spy had murdered Gareth, but she said the possible involvement of SIS staff in the death was a legitimate line of inquiry for the police. Next part of Dr. Wilcox's verdict. She believes someone else was inside Gareth's flat when he died, just like his family said. Although there's no direct evidence suggesting that he was in contact with someone right before he died, Dr. Wilcox believed that at the very least, a third party was present. She concluded that another party placed the bag containing Gareth into the bathtub, and on the balance of probabilities, locked the bag. Next, the coroner suspects that Gareth was likely alive when he was placed inside the bag, and that he probably died shortly afterward from CO2 poisoning. Even though his exact cause of death couldn't be determined, there were no signs that he had been smothered or asphyxiated. So the conclusion is that he had been overcome by hypercapnia, which causes elevated carbon dioxide levels in the blood. This could have happened within just a couple minutes of being inside the bag. But there's a debate about whether he was forced inside or whether he climbed in willingly. In either case, Detective Chief Inspector of the London Metropolitan Police, Jackie Sieber, is quoted as saying she is, quote, satisfied that a third party may have been involved, end quote. According to Coroner Wilcox, there was also inconclusive DNA fragments from 2 people found on the bag itself. Another thing she says is proof that he didn't climb in there alone. Evidence at the inquest suggested that it would have been virtually impossible for Gareth to have locked himself in that bag all on his own. 2 experts testified that it would have been very hard for him, who was 5'8", 130 pounds, to climb into the bag and then lock it from the inside out without any type of assistance. Together, these 2 escape artists tried over 400 times to do this themselves, but they were unsuccessful each and every time. These were people trained in the art of escape. One of them was a man by the name of Peter Falding, an expert on confined spaces. He said this about his findings, quote, I couldn't say it's impossible, but I think even Houdini would have struggled with this one, end quote. Also bizarre, all surfaces around the bathtub, including the walls and the sides of the basin, were all free of evidence. If Gareth had been carrying out some type of peculiar experiment, he wouldn't care if he left any foot or fingerprints, Dr. Wilcox said. The experiment refers to the theory, which the coroner rejected as part of her verdict, that his death stemmed from an interest in autoerotic activity, bondage, or cross-dressing, something that we'll talk about more in the theory section. Dr. Wilcox also rejected the theory of suicide. To briefly go back to the women's clothing found inside of his home, there was a video found on one of his cell phones showing him dancing naked while covering himself with a pair of leather boots. But Dr. Wilcox believes that reflected his interest in fashion. She specifically pointed to those 2 college courses he took on fashion, as well as his sister Carrie's testimony that he was a very generous gift giver. As for the wigs, she described them as, quote, far more consistent with dress up, such as attendance at a manga conference. Earlier in the inquest, one of Gareth's friends explained that they had a shared interest in the Japanese genre of cartoons and comic books. Also to note, Gareth was found naked in the bag, not in women's clothing. And even if he did have some sort of sexual interest in women's clothing or shoes, what did that have to do with actually what happened to him? To Dr. Wilcox, the various leaks about his personal life represented efforts, quote, by some third party to manipulate a section of the evidence, end quote. It was all a distraction. Next, the other evidence suggesting the presence of a third party. According to the coroner, the biggest piece of evidence pointing toward a third party was the heat inside of the flat. When the police showed up, the heat was turned all the way up, even though it was summertime. This has led people to speculate whether someone had intentionally did that in order to intentionally speed up the decomposition, as well as destroy any possible forensic evidence. Would the heat make it impossible to determine a specific cause of death? So that was the inquest verdict. The coroner found in a narrative verdict that Garrett's death was, quote, unnatural and likely to have been criminally mediated. She was, quote, satisfied that on the balance of probabilities that Garrett was killed unlawfully, end quote. But there was insufficient evidence to give a verdict of unlawful killing. Instead, she delivered an open verdict. Likely cause of death, unlawfully killed by suffocation. However, the coroner's inquest isn't the end of the story. Following this verdict, the Metropolitan Police launched its own investigation lasting over 12 months. This all-new investigation gave them unprecedented access to MI6 and its staff. At the time, it seemed like we might finally get some answers. However, in December 2013, the Metropolitan Police announced that despite a re-examination of all of the evidence and the investigation of new leads, no definitive answers have been discovered about what happened or what caused his death. They said, quote, the most likely scenario was that he died alone in his flat as a result of an accident by accidentally locking himself inside the bag, end quote. So according to the Metropolitan Police, this was all an accident, despite what the experts concluded at the inquest about this being next to impossible for him to do on his own. Now, insert Russia. In September and October 2005, a former KGB agent who eventually abandoned Russia and now lives in Britain claimed that Russia was responsible. Here's his claim. He says that the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, also known as the SVR, was responsible for what happened. According to him, the SVR tried and failed to blackmail Gareth into becoming a double agent. In response to those attempts by the SVR, Gareth claimed that he knew, quote, the identity of a Russian spy inside of the GCHQ. This former KGB agent claims that this threat meant that, quote, the CVR then had no alternative but to exterminate him to protect their agent inside GCHQ, end quote. So essentially, Gareth was killed by the Russians because he threatened to expose their undercover agent working at the GCHQ, Gareth's former employer. When it comes to how he was killed by the Russians, this former KGB agent says that the SVR killed him by, quote, an untraceable poison introduced into his ear, end quote. Is there any truth to this theory involving the Russians? We don't know. If he was correct and the Russians used this untraceable poison, then nothing would have shown up at the autopsy. And according to the coroner, no drugs, alcohol, or poisons were found in his system when he died. But was it possible for the poison to dissolve after being stuffed inside the bag for over a week in the heat? Fast forward to 2023 and 2024. The Metropolitan Police did a forensic review of the case, but their findings weren't what his family had hoped for. Here's a direct quote from Neil Johnson, the senior investigating officer. Quote, since 2010, the Met has carried out extensive inquiries into Garrett's death. An independent forensic review began in January 2021, and we received the findings in November 2023. No new DNA evidence was found, and no further lines of inquiry were identified. We have informed Garrett's family of the outcome, and our thoughts remain with them." End quote. The review in 2021 was prompted after scientists had previously been unable to obtain full DNA profiles from some of the samples found inside of his flat. So the hope was that advances in DNA testing could be used to identify them. But according to the police, that new testing was unsuccessful. No new information was gained, suggesting that a third party was present at the time that Gareth died. It's now 2025, the time I'm sitting down to record this episode, and the case of the spy in the bag remains unsolved. What forensic evidence is out there, and will it ever be used to solve this mystery? Let's talk about it. Let's talk about what forensic evidence was found inside of the flat and whether it supports the inquest findings or the police investigation that says this was an accident. Gareth's family has long said that crucial DNA was interfered with and that fingerprints left at the scene were removed as part of a cover-up. They also said the front doorknob to the flat had been removed and replaced by the police during the initial investigation, even though there weren't any signs of a break-in. Starting from the beginning, there are many conflicting reports out there about the DNA evidence in this case and whether any DNA or fingerprints belonging to a third party were ever found. It's been reported that inconclusive DNA samples from at least 2 contributors were found on the duffel bag. That's something we talked about when discussing the coroner's inquest. But besides that, there are conflicting reports of up to 15 traces of DNA spread throughout the flat. We also know about the unknown DNA profile found on his left hand, which later turned out to be contaminated. LGC, the forensic company that tested the sample, later apologized to his family, saying that it was a massive mistake. But the biggest thing that sticks out to me, why weren't his fingerprints found on the shower or the bathtub? Why was the bathroom virtually free and clean of all forensic evidence? That alone makes me wonder and makes me suspect that parts of the crime scene may have been wiped down. If Gareth got inside of that bathtub and that duffel bag willingly on his own, why was he so afraid of leaving behind his fingerprints? None of his fingerprints were found on the padlock either. Also, when the police first showed up, the bathroom lights were out and the curtain was closed. So on top of manipulating his body in a way to get inside of the bag, he locked it, kept the keys inside with him, didn't leave a single fingerprint on the tub, closed the curtains, and turned the lights off. Not necessarily in that order. Well, some reports suggest that Gareth kept his flat neat and clean. So maybe that explains the lack of fingerprints or DNA evidence. But maybe it doesn't. Metropolitan Police Deputy Assistant Commissioner Martin Hewitt said it was, quote, theoretically possible for Williams to lower himself into the bag without touching the rim of the bathtub, end quote. Also, the key. The key to the padlock was found locked inside of the bag underneath one of his legs. There also weren't any gloves found inside the bag, so he probably didn't wear any. I'm not quite sure what to make of all of that. One piece of evidence that was retested in 2021 was a green towel found in his bathroom. But when the results came back, only his DNA was found on it, furthering the police's claim that this was an accident and there was no third-party involvement. There were also no signs of forced entry into the flat, something else that we talked about earlier. However, according to his family, all of the forensic evidence was tampered with. Someone either cleaned up the crime scene when he was killed, or someone went inside afterward. They also argued that critical forensic evidence was likely lost since MI6 didn't report him missing for over a week. Had they called the police sooner to perform that welfare check, maybe there would have still been evidence. There was also the issue of the heater. What could the heat have done to any DNA or fingerprints? We know the heat played a role in the rate at which his body decomposed, making it even harder to determine what exactly happened to him. So when it comes to the forensic evidence in this case, it depends on who you ask. And that's just one of the many reasons this case is so mysterious and bizarre. Gareth would have had to get himself into that tub all on his own, into that bag, lock it, without leaving behind a single fingerprint on the shower, bathtub, bag, or padlock. All for what? I mentioned a moment ago that Gareth's doorknob had been removed and replaced by the police during the initial investigation in 2010, even though there were no signs of a break-in. This was also another item that was allegedly retested in 2023 using a technology called DNA 17, which examined 17 different areas of DNA. But again, according to the Metropolitan Police, this retesting didn't reveal any new evidence. So it's unclear whether or not anything was found on the doorknob. It's also unclear why it was removed in the first place. Again, if there weren't any signs of a break-in into his apartment, why would you remove his door? Okay, finally, the theories. There is no shortage of theories when it comes to this case, so let's dive right in. The first theory takes us back to the women's clothing found in his closet. Even if he liked to occasionally dress in women's clothing, which we don't know if he did or not, I don't think that had anything to do with what happened. So the theory is that he might have had to dress like a woman for his work for MI6. He basically worked undercover as a female. So that could explain why he had a wardrobe full of women's clothes, shoes, and wigs. But if that's true, why were the tags attached to most of them? If he had to dress undercover as a female, wouldn't he take the tags off before wearing them? Theory number 2, a sex game gone really, really wrong. While the coroner rejected this, some people believe that he may have been involved in autoerotic activity or bondage. So the theory goes, he did this to achieve some type of sexual pleasure from it. But somewhere along the way, things went wrong and he accidentally died. Those who believe this theory point to what his former landlady said about finding him tied to the bed a few years earlier. They may also point to the frequent visits to bondage websites. Theory number 3, MI6 cover-up. Some people suspect that MI6 was involved in his death and attempted to cover it up. That might explain why many of its staff weren't interviewed during the initial part of the investigation. They never reported him missing until his sister called, and why there were no fingerprints or DNA found at the scene. It was all part of a cover-up. His own family, Gareth's own family, said that it could have been a person, quote, specializing in the dark arts of the secret services, end quote. This was also a theory that coroner Fiona Wilcox seemed to hint at. Theory number 4, involvement of intelligence intelligence agencies. Besides the MI6, there's been speculation that a hostile intelligence agency, such as Russia, may have been involved. We already talked about Russia with that former agent accusing them of poisoning him through his ear. Theory number 5, hacking and blackmail. A theory proposed during the inquest and subsequent investigations suggested that his death could have been linked to a possible act of hacking or blackmail. But that theory can't be ruled in or out because very little has been revealed about what exactly he did, either for SIS or the GCHQ. Theory number 6, escapology. This is closely related to theory number 2, the sex game gone really, really wrong. Those who like this theory suggest he did it because he wanted to see if he could get out of the bag. Maybe it was for a sexual purpose, but maybe it wasn't. It's possible he just really wanted to find out if he could do it. Again, remember what his former landlady said about that previous incident. He told her he just wanted to see if he could get out. And that's just the beginning. There are probably so many other theories out there about what could have happened. If you've read anything about this case online, then you know there's no shortage of possible theories. But as of today, they're just theories. The truth about Gareth Williams' death remains a mystery. But beyond the mysteries, this case also highlights the challenges of investigating possible crimes involving people working for government intelligence agencies. What information should be released to the public and what shouldn't as a matter of national security? The rumors and speculation surrounding his life and death only serve as a stark reminder of the secret nature of intelligence work. But even more heartbreaking, the family. Just like you and me, they are left in the dark about what really happened to their son, their brother, and their friend. Now, the question I posed at the top of the episode: was this murder? Or was it an accident? Was Gareth Williams killed by a fellow Secret Intelligence Service agent? Or was a foreign intelligence agency to blame, maybe Russia? Was there a cover-up, and that's why virtually zero forensic evidence was found inside of his flat? Or does the lack of evidence suggest that he was alone and did this to himself? Why was one of his cell phones reset to its factory settings just hours before he was scheduled to be at work? And did his internet searches for bondage and women's clothing have anything to do with his death? Was it physically possible for him to get inside of that duffel bag all on his own, or did he have help from someone else? Could he have locked the bag from the inside out without leaving a single fingerprint behind on the duffel bag or the bathtub or the padlock? And if so, if Gareth Williams got inside of that bag completely on his own, stark naked, why? What do you think the lack of forensic evidence surrounding this mysterious death means? To share your thoughts on this week's episode, follow the show on Instagram and Facebook. To find out what I think about the case, sign up to become a patron at patreon.com/forensictales. After each episode, I release a bonus episode sharing my personal thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to Forensic Tales so you don't miss an episode. We release a new episode every Monday. If you love the show, consider leaving us a positive review. You can also help support the show through Patreon. Thank you so much for joining me this week. Please join me next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings. Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. For a small monthly contribution, you can help create new compelling cases for the show, help fund research, and assist with production and editing costs. For supporting the show, you'll become one of the first to listen to new ad-free episodes and gain access to exclusive content. To learn more, please visit patreon.com/forensictales. Forensic Tales is a podcast made possible by our Patreon producers: Tony A., Christine B., Sherry A., Michael D., Nicola, Jerry M., Megan G., Ureli, Jerry, Ann F., Carol A., Shannon D., Marianne C., Lois B., Lynn H., Ashley S., Alice B., Danielle D., and Savannah. If you'd like to become a producer of the show, head over to our Patreon page or send me an email at courtney@forensictales.com. For a complete list of sources used in this episode, please visit forensictales.com. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.